Good to have you. My name is Sam, and for those who haven't participated before, this conversation is part of the Pathways to Progress speaker series. And if you want to see the other installments, you can look up Pathways to Progress on YouTube. Pathways to Progress is a group focused on issues of human prosperity and progress. And so this speaker series, as well as our reading group, explores questions about what drives growth and sustainable growth, how innovation occurs, and what the history of progress can teach us about the present and the future. And we're joined today by an excellent guest to discuss those topics, James Morton Turner, author of Charged, A History of Batteries, and Lessons for a Clean Energy Future, which is the book that we'll be focusing on for the most part today. Dr. Turner is an environmental historian whose work has appeared everywhere from the periodical Science to the pages of the New York Times. He's vice president of the American Society for Environmental History, and he has other books dealing with the history of the Republican Party's approach to the environment and with the contested idea of wilderness in environmental political history. Besides reading his work, I would strongly encourage you to visit the websites for his two most recent books, which are themselves full of data and good information, including a tracker of new green energy projects in the US. So now that's enough of me for now, and I'll turn things over to Dr. Turner, who's going to give us an introduction to the content of his most recent book.
Great. Well, thanks, Sam. It's nice to be here and just good to have a chance to talk with all of you. So I thought we could proceed as I'd spend 10 minutes or so just trying to set up and hit on some of the big themes of the book for anybody who hasn't had a chance to look at it or just refresh people's memories if you had, and then we would open it up for some discussion. The whole series that you all are a part of sounds really great. So glad to be here. So let me see if I can remember on Zoom how to share my screen. Here it comes. Okay, and now I want to reorganize things so I can see everybody at the same time. Otherwise, it feels like I'm talking into a black box, which is decidedly not as much fun as talking to you all. All right, there we go. Good. Okay. Yeah, so that's the title I put on this this kind of opening presentation, which is to think about the matter of a clean energy transition, and that really captures, kind of in my mind, the core contribution of my book, Charged. So you all are familiar with the book, at least at some level, and there are a bunch of different ways I can kind of tell you kind of the origin study or origin stories for this book. But the one I'll focus on for today is kind of Charged was a response to the Green New Deal. And, this is 2019. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Ed Markey introduced the Green New Deal as a resolution. And, in the middle of the first Trump administration, kind of this new energy around climate action was just exciting for so many different reasons. In part because it did all the things that people expected that climate proposal, a climate resolution in Congress would do, right? Calling for 100% renewable energy, net zero greenhouse gas emissions, addressing issues of resiliency, and making investments in infrastructure to help make all of this possible, right? That's what you expected from a climate bill. But I think, part of the reason it has got people at places like Wellesley Climate Progressives excited is because it went beyond that, right? To focus on climate change as a social issue, as an issue of climate justice, focusing on, what a just transition could mean, centering issues of justice and equality, and some of the policy goals, focusing on and acknowledging historic oppression. All of these things were an important part of the Green New Deal as well. And so around here, just tremendous enthusiasm for the Green New Deal, which I shared in. And part of this as a historian is just interesting to see kind of the rhetoric of the New Deal reframed, kind of relaunched, right? And kind of these explicit comparisons to trying to create commitment to addressing climate kind of on the scale of what happened in the New Deal in the post-World War II era, where addressing social issues went with economic growth and investment in infrastructure. And so all of that was really interesting. But as a historian who'd been thinking a lot about how to kind of make an intervention into discussions around climate change, the one thing that really struck me for all that was good about the Green New Deal was that it didn't acknowledge that if we were going to do these things, if we were going to make this energy transition, make these investments, build out transmission supplies and solar farms and electric vehicles, we were going to need a lot of stuff to do it, right? It was going to involve a lot of mining. And for all the things the Green New Deal covered, like it had nothing to say about the mining industry except that it was going to provide support for fossil fuel coal miners, right, as part of a just transition, right? But kind of the idea that the New Deal, right, involved a ton of concrete, right, and lots of aluminum and lots of copper to do rural electrification, right? That parallel wasn't being drawn at all with the Green New Deal in 2019. And so for me, that was kind of the light bulb moment. It's like, wait a second, all of this work, all of this thinking that I've been doing about batteries and their role in the clean energy transition and their history is really a useful way to think about the material implications of making an energy transition. That if we're going to leave the fossil fuels in the ground, we are going to have to pull out a number of other materials important to making this clean energy transition. So, about, really not too many people were kind of focused talking about this publicly in 2018, 2019. The World Bank, a couple of other groups kind of pulled together some research and put out studies. This is a chart from one study from HUN from 2020, suggesting that addressing climate change over the next half century would drive up demand for critical minerals by 4.5 times. Right, these sorts of reports started to put this issue on the radar screen. And there have been some better studies since. This one here I recommend because what it's showing us is that if we look at kind of 2020 and look at mining activity around the world, kind of coal extraction adds up to almost 9 billion tons of coal extracted each year. And they're showing that if we make the energy transitions, that's what this graph shows, we're going to see the coal industry shrink overall, right? So the gray shrinks down to a very small amount of coal mining in 2050. And we're going to see mining activity decrease. So by 2050, let's see about 6,000, 7,000, I'm going to say 6 or 7 million metric tons because that's the right unit there, right? That's what mining is going to drop to. But as we make that transition, right, and here's kind of the key point, right, we're going to see this tremendous growth in mining for critical minerals to supply the batteries, the wind, the solar technologies. So we're going to see a decrease in mining, right? But we're going to see new forms of mining, new mining industries, expansion of existing mining industries to meet this demand. So that is the framework. Like that's what drove kind of my interest in writing Charged. And as I, come at this, I'm coming at it as a historian. And so, the book itself is an environmental history of batteries, right? But it is, making this contribution to encouraging people to think really carefully about what the implications of this clean energy transition are. So the book, just real briefly, is organized around 3 historical case studies. One Sam and I were chatting about a little bit, kind of the importance of lead mining, and lead mining for the battery industry, right? Lead acid batteries are the starter batteries that are in all of the vehicles on the roads, including most electric vehicles still have a lead acid starter battery in them. So that's one case study. Lead acid batteries are the most highly recycled product in the world. So they're interesting for that reason. The second case study focuses on the disposable AA batteries, which turn out to be probably the most kind of polluting source of energy that we routinely use. It just takes a tremendous amount of material to make a high quality material to make a disposable battery. So that's the second case study that I focus on. And then the third case study, which became 2 chapters, is the lithium-ion battery industry, kind of tracing the rise of lithium-ion batteries in portable electronics, and then scaling up to utility scale and electric vehicles. That's kind of the second part of that case study. So those are the case studies for the project. And just quickly, kind of the themes that I kind of pull out. There are a couple of themes that I pull out of studying batteries, which are not the usual topic for energy historians. In fact, as this first point here suggests, like often energy historians have treated batteries as like a footnote because they're so small and they provide so little energy. And so I'm really kind of writing against that to say, batteries aren't a footnote. They actually have played a key enabling role, and that's the language I use. They've enabled a lot of other technologies, even if the amount of energy they deliver is so small. So we should not think of them just as a footnote. Um, that energy is valuable, and so this is the second point here, not because there's lots of it that's stored in batteries, but because the quality of that energy is so important. So I focus on this idea of energy quality, right? That's really what we value, right? That batteries are portable, that they're instantaneous, um, that they, in some cases, can be recharged, right? These are qualities that make batteries very important, even if they don't hold a whole lot of energy in and of themselves. So that's an important theme. The third one here is what I describe as a culture of mobility. And I think we're thinking more about this now with artificial intelligence. And the reason I use the word culture of mobility is, often climate activists have been really concerned about moving people around with cars or planes, but have kind of given the information technologies a pass, right? Kind of all the things we do online have been seen as kind of ethereal and not having a material impact, right? But I think batteries are really useful because they're important both to moving people and things around, right? But also to moving information around and reminding us that our culture of mobility, there's a connection between moving physical things and information around. They both have an environmental impact, right? And we've been talking about that a lot more with the surge of attention to artificial intelligence. And then the last point here is just the visibility of energy. Like what's useful? Like why are batteries good to think with? Well, one of the reasons is because unlike pretty much all of those other forms of energy, like you can hold a battery. It's like you're holding energy in your hand. And just, people are really worried about batteries, right? Where do the batteries go when I'm done with them? Like, that's whenever I told somebody that's the prize, this is what I'm working on. That's what they wanted to know. What happens to my battery when I put it in the trash? Like, for me, that's actually not as important as where your battery came from in the first place. Um, but the visibility of energy is an important theme as well. So just broadly, those are some of the themes. A lot of the work that the book does is to connect the stories of the people, the places, the communities that are involved in the battery industry and have been involved over time. It's a history, how those materials connect the technologies we rely upon to different parts of the world. So often when we talk about lithium, people think of Chile and the salt flats, this upper image. But don't actually realize that most of the lithium in the world comes from Australia, where it's mined from hard rock mining, kind of similar to most other mines. There's been more attention to the cobalt industry, the majority of which is still sourced from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which raises real concerns about the ways in which that cobalt is extracted and impacts on local communities, including child workers. Indonesia is an important supply of nickel. It's not one I actually focus on in the book. I focus on Russia in the book. Um, and then carbon, which, people don't tend to focus too much on carbon, but if we're talking about batteries, carbon is actually the most important material just in terms of mass. It makes up the largest proportion of all battery well, the alkaline batteries and the lithium ion batteries. So I focus on carbon. But throughout the book, I'm looking at different communities that are pulled into these supply chains and into these industries and what the consequences are for those communities. It's about geopolitics. I wrote about this in the New York Times a year ago in the fall when China threatened tariffs, and actually not just tariffs, but withhold shipments of graphite, which is a key material, and just kind of raised concerns about the geopolitics, kind of the new geopolitics of a clean energy transition. China was not important petroleum politics during the 20th century, but is going to be a key player with these critical materials in the 21st century. So that's an important theme of the book as well. This graph here shows that it's not actually that China's mining all of these materials. They've instead built relations with many countries that can supply the materials invested in these countries through the Belt and Road Initiative, and they're bringing the materials back to China for the midstream processing, and then the downstream lithium-ion battery cells. So kind of stepping back, I'm going to wrap up here and open it up. The argument, just kind of pin it down, is that a clean energy future isn't, it's not enough just to phase out the fossil fuels. We also need to scale up the production of clean energy relevant materials. We need to do that sustainably and justly. And that is a really immense challenge. Um, and to the extent there's kind of good news here, it's that most of these mines and factories and supply chains haven't actually been built. I mean, some of them have, but this industry is growing very quickly. And so there is, still a chance to ensure that that development does happen in ways that are more transparent, just, and sustainable. So that's kind of the big point that Charged ends with. And it includes some more kind of specific kind of policy relevant recommendations. Um, but maybe to come back to where Sam started us off, because of kind of my interest in, what it would mean to do this in a more responsible way to address some of those geopolitics. Right as I was finishing the book, I started tracking investments in the battery industry specifically initially. Um, and then the Inflation Reduction Act got passed the same year. And I was sitting on a database of information about what was happening in the US and the battery sector. And so I have tracked very carefully, worked with students here at Wellesley to keep track of, the growth of the battery industry over the last 3 years in the United States. We've expanded out that tracking to focus on the wind, solar sectors as well. It's now on a new website called the Big Green Machine, which is tracking these investments in North America. So it's the United States, Mexico, and Canada as well. And our tracking also includes analysis. There's been a lot of attention to how all of these projects are going to Republican congressional districts. We've been tracking that, see that, but we're also tracking kind of what countries are investing in these projects in the US, how they map on to socioeconomic indicators for different communities, environmental justice factors. So all of this material is on the Big Green Machine website that we maintain and update regularly. So, yeah, that's a little bit about Charged, a little bit about what I've been up to, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts, try and answer questions, yeah, and see where it goes.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Yeah, I think that was a good ad for the book. And I'll ask you questions for a bit here, and then at the end we'll open things up to everyone who has questions. So people in
Okay,
the audience be holding on to those for now.
sure.
So one thing that I wanted to ask is sort of what is the intervention that you wanted to make with the book? I think that as I read the book, I was thinking about the target audience, and it seems like in part, at least, it's people who are already environmentalists and nuancing sort of their approach to environmentalism. Do you think that's an appropriate read, or like what do you think is the ideal target audience that you're trying to reach?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's always more than one audience, and I do think one audience is kind of the environmentalist who, is concerned about climate change and, hadn't really had a chance to step back and think about, the costs that come with a clean energy transition. And so really, trying to raise awareness there. Um, I think another audience, was my students. My students kind of inspired. I teach a class on climate change. It was my engagement with students, kind of realizing kind of collectively we had no idea about batteries. Wanting to reach an audience of people who were interested in the topic, and kind of provide an accessible background to batteries kind of through the lens of history to help them kind of more informed about energy systems. So, I think of students as kind of, being maybe an audience, similar to, but also different in some ways than just the environmentalists. The third audience, though, were policymakers. And, the book doesn't end with kind of specific legislative suggestions, but, I did in the book, arguing for domestic policy to do things that environmentalists don't like, to do more mining. I think we're going to rely on these materials for a clean energy transition. The United States needs to supply more of those materials, and that's not easy to do. There are going to be costs to doing that. We can't do it everywhere, but to simply import or export the costs of this to other parts of the world, um, that raises its own set of justice issues. And so, calling for the U.S. to adopt policies that would invest in mineral supply chains and processing, invest in the battery industry, and do it in ways that are more sustainable. Those are all points that I end on. And I never thought that I would influence the policy process. And it's just by coincidence. I mean, the book hadn't even come out basically that the Inflation Reduction Act got passed, but it certainly did some of the work that I was asking for at the end of charge. So I was hoping to engage with policymakers. So I guess those are kind of the three audiences I was thinking of, along with environmental historians. I like them too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I think I'm curious to kind of continue to pursue a little bit the question of how environmentalists should think about these issues. And maybe to introduce the like standard environmental mantra, reduce, reuse, recycle. And I feel that you
Oh,
do
yeah.
come back to those kind of time and time again in the book and nuance them in different ways. And so to what extent do you think that classic mantra holds up when it comes to batteries? How useful is it? Where is it useful? Where does it kind of fall apart a little bit?
Yeah. Um, I've got some different slides where I literally like,
Mhm.
I don't use animations on my slides very often, but I blow that up.
Mhm.
Um, so I don't think reduce, reuse, recycle um, is the right starting point for thinking about the clean energy transition. So to come back to the point that I was making about the disposable batteries, right? The first question anybody asks is, well, what can I do with all my disposable batteries? They're all in my cupboard. I want to recycle them and do the right thing. And they want to recycle them. They don't, and and really, all of the costs are in sourcing the batteries in the first place. That's what people should be concerned about. Where is the zinc and the manganese and the graphite? Where is all of that coming from in the first place? Right, managing that supply chain. And so I think, that's kind of a useful analogy for the clean energy transition as a whole. Um, to to reach net zero, thinking about progress kind of on a broad scale, we're going to need a lot more stuff. I mean, I personally don't think we're going to kind of remake society in a way that is kind of you know I guess, on a degrowth model in the next couple of decades. And given if you're willing to go with me there on that assumption, then we're going to need to invest in electrifying, right? Electrify everything, right? Is a kind of important talking point these days. We're going to have to electrify a lot of personal infrastructure, right? What people have in their homes, what they drive, what they cook on, how they do laundry, uh, at the same time, we make that accessible to many more people who don't have those things right now. Um, and we're going to need to change public infrastructure. And, so transmission grids, renewable energy generation, maybe more nuclear power plants, right? To do those things is not about reducing or reusing. Recycling will become important, but in the near term, it's about building a lot of things that will allow us to, electrify devices and power them with low carbon sources of energy. So yeah, I don't think the starting point of reduce or reuse, helps us think about that in a careful way. So the idea that I introduce in the book is what I call industrial ecological literacy, which is really a call for leaning into the industrial systems, understanding their environmental impacts, understanding the trade-offs that come with all of these technologies, and becoming fluent and concerned about the supply chains and the places that using any one of these technologies, connects us to and entangles us in around the world. I mean, in my mind, like it's helpful to know where your water comes from and what kind of species of bird that is outside. But we are interacting with nature when we, flip on our smartphone, and we should want to know where the cobalt and the graphite come from as well. So that's my call for an industrial ecological literacy, which I realize is a little more cumbersome than reduce, reuse, recycle. But I think, to really engage with the trade-offs and do our best to manage those. That's the kind of thinking that we need. So that's what I was pushing for.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. I think that it reminds me of, and I believe that the your first book, the foreword, was written by William Cronin. Is that right? Yeah, and
Yep.
the sort of notion of problematizing our difference from nature, that nature is part of what we do, and it's part of all the processes that we engage with. Do you think that that idea is succeeding? What do you think could change to make it succeed more? Like what, yeah, is that percolating, do you think, like in the broader culture, or is that something that's still a little constrained to environmental history?
Uh, the general kind of problematizing our
Mhm.
relationship to nature. I guess I think of specific examples, and I guess I want to kind of bring them back and ground them in discussions around the energy transition. But I would say there are a couple of things that strike me as interesting. I mean, one, I think there is a much more attention to the material implications of a clean energy transition, and I think that's emerging from a couple of different directions. I think you know, kind of progressive climate activists are really concerned, climate justice advocates are really concerned about the impacts of scaling up mining industries for good reason. And so we've seen a lot of scrutiny for that reason. And I think, but we're also seeing it kind of from the other side of the political spectrum, where some conservatives see, opportunities. They've long supported mining industry and extractive industry, and they see this as kind of an opportunity to grow those industries. Others see it in a geopolitical lens and are, worried that this is actually a reason not to do an energy transition because it will expose us to a whole new set of geopolitical risks. But I think kind of what they share is just a willingness to kind of acknowledge that clean energy technologies come with their own set of material demands and trade-offs. And I don't, you go back to the 2019 kind of Green New Deal, that wasn't really, it wasn't at the, it wasn't on, not on the front burner. It wasn't really on the stove at the time. So I think, that's one place where I think we're seeing, some complexity. I think the other is, just how much attention there has been to artificial intelligence and the consequences for energy demand. Right at this moment where we thought we were going to electrify everything and, transition to renewable energy, which would increase electricity demand. I mean, now artificial intelligence, depending, I guess, on which model you use the Chat GPT or the new Chinese model. How much energy are you going to need? How many processors are you going to need? But in just real attention to these digital technologies have environmental material costs. They're still rooted in the physical world around us, and people acknowledging that is about kind of better establishing just our ties to these technologies and their environmental costs. So I think that's going in the right direction.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I might shift us a little bit, maybe back towards batteries. And just something that really struck me in your discussion, and I think that's relevant to a lot of what um, gets talked about in the Pathways to Progress sort of group, is the way that innovation occurs in the battery space, or how it's occurred over time. And it was striking how evolutionary it was, how there weren't really big Copernican leaps. And even something like the invention of the lithium ion battery, which seems maybe like an exception, turns out to be about many different teams of people across really long distances, sort of stumbling forward. But the results have been really great. And so I have two questions for you, and one maybe is a little ahistorical, but I'm wondering if you can maybe speculate on how likely was it that we got the lithium ion battery? Like how contingent was that? Was it always sort of on the cards, or did we just get lucky? And then are there any lessons we can draw from that process about how we should go about thinking about innovation and change?
Yeah. All right. Well, the second part of that's easier than the
Yeah.
first. So I'm going to start with the second part.
Okay.
You did a nice job of summarizing kind of where I can wind up on lithium-ion batteries, but also lead-acid batteries and alkaline batteries. And battery um, technologies are really finicky. They're really materials intensive, and they take a lot of refinement. And that's what we saw with the lithium-ion batteries. They didn't. I think you said they're like really fantastic. I didn't use that language. I said they're
Yeah.
just good enough. Like they're
Yeah.
just good enough. And they've gotten better over time. They've become substantially better, and it has been a process of lots of incremental refinement um, in the technology and the manufacturing processes, which have generally made them, do the things we want better, so they can hold more energy, they can discharge it more quickly, so you can accelerate a car faster. They can be, turned into different shapes because of transition to lithium polymer batteries. They're safer because the separators in them are better than they were. And so just a whole series of incremental changes, and just as you said, right, happening with different groups around the world over time. Um, and I think that's pretty characteristic for the battery industry as a whole. Just a slightly different example is from the alkaline battery industry. It used to be back in the 1980s, they used lots of mercury. About 1% of every battery was mercury, which served as a stabilizer. It kept it from self-discharging. And the concern about mercury grew in the 1980s. And it was really interesting because all the battery companies basically figured out how to get the mercury out in slightly different ways at the same time. So there wasn't kind of any kind of breakthrough moment. It was just kind of an engineering problem they all solved in different ways when they were kind of challenged. It became clear that they needed to do this, in part because they didn't want to recycle the batteries, which is what would have happened if they left the mercury in. Um, so I think, yeah, across the battery industry, incremental change. The Did we get lucky? I mean, I think this is where I come back to kind of putting on my environmental historian's hat, which I think the environment has agency. We don't control it, right? We're partnering with these different materials, right? We like copper because it's so malleable and conducts electrons so well. Um, you know, People knew that lithium had the potential to be a good charge carrier because of its orbital configuration. And so, there was a lot of tinkering and work. And so I think, I don't know, I guess I would say, I guess I would want to, not suggest that it was luck. It wasn't inevitable, but it was, it's useful to think about it as kind of a partnership where, people can't invent these things. We have to partner with the resources that are available. And that's the work that these material scientists, these electrochemists, people like John Goodenough, did and helping to invent the early lithium ion batteries. But, it's also someone else figuring out the anode, the other half of the battery in Japan. Um, so, but yeah, so I guess just to kind of wrap that up, I would argue for this idea of partnership as opposed to something that was inevitable or just lucky.
Nice. Yeah. Well, there's lots of other content in charge, so I'm just and people can read the book. So I'm just gonna ask you one final question on that before maybe we talk a little bit about environmental history more generally. Um, and just reading the book, it's very clear that you have a hands-on approach. You talk about like tracing where your battery that you throw away is going to go, like what that process is going to look like. You talk about taking apart your computer to look at the lithium ion battery. I can't remember if it's on your website or somewhere else that you talk about like retrofitting your own home. And so what do you think that like someone couldn't get from the book about batteries that only by directly or materially engaging with batteries that you've come to like appreciate and respect? Is there something like that is hard to appreciate when you read about it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we all use batteries so often now that I guess I'm not sure I have any special insight, um, into that question because like I've written a lot and thought a lot about batteries in the industry, the supply chains. Um, but I guess for me, it's just the hands-on stuff is just driven by curiosity. That it's not enough just to leave the battery as a black box. Um, I wanted to take it apart. And I guess, for anybody who read the book, like I'd actually encourage you to go and, find an old laptop battery and take it apart. You're going to learn things that you're not going to learn from the book, or just, the magic of being able to connect a lemon and, put an LED battery in there and some copper and some zinc and connect it up all right and have the LED light, light up from a lemon, right? A lemon battery, that these things actually work. So, you know, I'm a big fan of kind of doing things, even though I'm a historian, um, at the same time that I learn about them. So I guess, what the book can't deliver is those kinds of experiences, but I hope it, gets people a little bit curious and also makes them think that maybe going to the, trying to see a mining landscape and appreciating that and thinking about the communities, kind of engaging and having those hands-on experiences too, that's worthwhile.
Nice. Yeah. So now I'm going to ask you a more general sort of question about like the study of technology and technological change in history. And I think that one of the things that like people interested in progress studies or the Pathways to Progress group are trying to do is look at history to get a sense about why the world gets better and how things improve. And you can frame this if you want in terms of batteries. But what do you think are some of the limits of that kind of study? What can we learn from that, and what can't we learn about progress and about the future from studying the past and issues of change and technological change?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I know a little bit about your group, but not a lot about your group. So just, kind of interesting to hear kind of the themes, things you all are interested in emerge here. I guess for me, one of the things that excites me most about being a historian and taking the past seriously, is, how much it makes me appreciate kind of how dynamic the world is, just how quickly things can change. Um, and often when people don't expect it, I think we're kind of trained to think that things are going to continue on the way they have been, even though people see change. But studying history for me just highlights, how significant the shifts in systems and um, resources, environmental consequences, opportunities, how much that has changed over time, whether we're looking back 20 years or a century. So I think, that's one thing that studying history can do, is help cultivate an appreciation both for, the good and the bad in that, but, take away kind of any, you know, kind of, as historians often say, it can make, the present feel strange because, have an appreciation for how much has changed in the past, but also how much could happen in the future. So I think that's one value I see in history. Um, I'm stalling out here a little bit.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, you
Nudge,
can. That was great. I think if you have more, you can say more. But I'm not. I don't want to push you.
well, nudge me if there's a part of that I left out.
Yeah, no, that was good. I think yeah, and then I think my final question before, because we're approaching the 45-minute mark, so before I turn it over to whatever anyone wants to ask, is another thing I was struck by just about method was like the interdisciplinary nature of what you were doing, and then also your desire to extend it through like the databases. And I was wondering if you have advice or thoughts about how to do that kind of interdisciplinary work, what that looked like for you, and how people can think in a slightly less siloed way when thinking about these issues.
Yeah, yeah, I'm a big fan of taking intellectual risks, and often that means kind of going beyond, the silo, engaging in new fields, trying to learn things. Battery, material chemistry is really hard. And I had a lot of help from chemists, just to get me as far down that path as I did. But so advice on this, and one is, to be willing to take those risks. When I was in graduate school, a historian, kind of, I think it was my first year in grad school, and big history seminar, kind of said, you're all going to be great historians, but go do something else that's going to make your history different, right? Go study art or economics, spend time taking classes outside of history and, consolidating, whatever you did as an undergraduate, as a master's degree student. And I took that seriously. I also had an opportunity to spend an extra year taking coursework in environmental science, and technology and policy. That turned out to be formative for me. I spent a whole year hanging out with scientists and engineers and policy people and really enjoyed those conversations. And yeah, and so that is what led me to environmental studies as a field as opposed to history. I'm still very much a historian. I think of myself as a historian, but engaged with kind of, you know, interdisciplinary research that's also kind of public facing and engaged in present day issues. So the tracking and the dashboard stuff. But yeah, so finding places that will kind of allow you to, take those risks, I think is important. And, that's been one of the most exciting things of being part of an environmental studies department is I've had lots of opportunities to do that.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think that's a good note for us to open things up to questions on. So yeah, anyone in the call who's interested in asking questions, you can do that now. So don't be shy.
Yeah, I have a question. So this is something on what you touched earlier about the IRA money going to predominantly Republican dominant districts and whatnot. But we have this situation where, Republicans are overwhelmingly opposed, or not overwhelmingly, but a lot of them are opposed to renewable energy and the energy transition. They might be in favor of uh, building a lot of nuclear power plants, but they might not be in favor of solar and whatnot. But we have this fact that, a lot of the money is going to their districts. And so I was wondering if um, how would you characterize this kind of uh, dichotomous situation where they seem to be benefiting from the energy transition in terms of investment, but they're politically opposed to it? And would they become more politically favorable, uh, or would they like it more if they started seeing jobs being produced and factories become uh, factories in their uh, neighborhoods and whatnot?
Yeah, right. When I think, that was the gamble that Democrats made with the Inflation Reduction Act, is that it would yield those sorts of political gains, and when it came time for elections, and clearly that did not work out. The Inflation Reduction Act had no impact at all on the election outcome, and even kind of where the projects are going is actually more Republican than it was before the election. So they became, yes, Republicans picked up some seats in places where lots of investment has gone. And I think, there are a couple of different explanations for this. I think one is just, this investment so early, it's largely just announcements. Some places construction has begun, but very few people are going to work in new battery or EV or solar factories. I mean, some are, but most of the projects are still promises. And so that's not, people are kind of dealing with the headache of construction, not the benefits of the new jobs and kind of seeing the promise of clean energy investment. So there's kind of a time in terms of electoral politics, just mismatch there. But I think the other part is that it's not actually about politics at all. And this is a point that I take up in the second book that I co-wrote, The Republic in Reversal. And there's a chapter in there about conservatives and climate change. And one of the arguments it makes is that climate activists worry a lot about the misinformation campaigns, and they worry a lot about the fossil fuel money in the elections. But for a lot of communities, especially the kinds of rural communities where these clean energy investments are going, they're communities that I think kind of cultural identity is tied to extraction and to the fossil fuel, sometimes the fossil fuel industry, but also just, fossil fuels. I think, I come from a relatively rural part of America. I know people who like to go out and drive their ATVs on the weekends and really enjoy the rumble of a V8 engine. And, the idea that that's going to go away, those kinds of hobbies, there's, comfort that comes with a gas stove igniting. And, they see risk, they hear lots of promises, but they also see lots of risks, and they're not ready to kind of make that jump yet. And I think, it's about economy, it's about politics, but it's also about, I think, a deep cultural attachment to fossil fuels and how comfortable people are with them, whereas renewables seem very risky as they look out into the future, no matter how many jobs the Democrats say they're creating. Yes, I would make an argument that, yes, culture is a big part of it.
I see. And I guess one follow-up question. I guess you wrote about the history of batteries, but do you have anything you're most excited about in terms of the future of batteries?
Yeah, I mean, so doing this definitely made me appreciate the possibilities. Never has there been a moment where there's been this much research going into batteries and new battery chemistries and better ways to, make improvements on existing batteries, new anodes. I think we're going to continue to see improvements. I think we're going to see new battery chemistries. It still takes a long time to bring a battery kind of into commercial production, but I think we're going to see that happen at a faster pace than we have just by virtue of the amount of work and research and investment that's going into this. So, yeah, so that's exciting. I think we'll see new kind of long duration storage. Um, yeah, so yeah, I see lots of possibilities for the battery industry. And I think kind of most optimistically, the U.S. will be at the forefront of that and be able to kind of leapfrog. I mean, China really dominates lithium-ion batteries, but kind of the rosiest outlook would be the U.S. could potentially play a big role in kind of whatever comes next.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if anyone else has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself, or if you would prefer, you can also put questions in the chat. Yeah, Laura.
Um, so along the veins of what Casey asked with politics, um, so why does it seem like in the US and how did climate change become so related and intertwined with identity politics? It appears to me more so this is the case in the US than other countries like in Western Europe or elsewhere. Like what is it so I don't know about climate change in the US that is so identity politics focused, or was that
Yeah.
always this case, or was there some transition that made this particularly this way?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I imagine other people here have some ideas about it. But yes, and my ideas would be one, no, it's not always been this way. I think kind of the turning point where um, climate became kind of part of identity politics or the culture wars in the US was really during Barack Obama's administration in 2010, when the Tea Party kind of revolt, the kind of grassroots Republican kind of pushback. I think that was kind of a pivotal moment. I think that's one important point. I think the other point is that it was also at that moment that people really started to take climate change more seriously, that it could lead to an energy transition, that it did pose a real threat to both to the fossil fuel industry, but also to a way of life that depended upon fossil fuels. Um, you know, Kind of the specific issue here is that there was a very big piece of climate legislation called the Waxman-Markey bill, which would have would have put a cap and trade system in place to regulate greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And often when we think about kind of that moment in American politics, it's Obamacare, the healthcare reform that kind of dominates our attention. But in many rural communities, like the threat of climate regulation was a really big deal. There was a group going around, Americans for Prosperity, like they're running um, they called it their hot air tour, and they went around to rural communities and had a big hot air balloon that they would float up and say, climate change is a hoax. And they would, talk to people about what it was going to do to their cost to drive their truck and to heat their farmhouses. And they really kind of raise these concerns about the impacts on people's lives. Um, so I think that was the moment that it started to become about identity, especially on the right, because that was the moment that it seemed like a real threat to kind of a history of American fossil fuel abundance. And I think rural America is kind of built on fossil fuel abundance in this country. And so when that, was really at risk, and I think that's the moment it started to become at risk, that's when we started to see it become a deeply polarized issue. Because really before that, Republicans, John McCain was a big climate, advocate for addressing climate change. Um, so yeah, that's kind of something. I guess a couple of thoughts in response to your good question.
Okay. Speak now or forever hold your peace, I think is where we're at. Okay, great. Well, we appreciate having you, and thank you for giving your time. If we weren't on Zoom, I would ask for a round of applause, but on Zoom, that's just an absolutely terrible idea. So yeah, thank you for coming. And for everyone on the call, just a reminder that the recording will be available on Zoom if you want to go back and reference it, and to pick up the book. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you all. Have a good night.